After weeks of waking up with mysterious bites, John thought he had picked up fleas from the shelter he managed. But when his wife took a closer look, she screamed in horror. For the third week in a row, John woke up with the same strange bites on his arms, neck, and back. The itching was unbearable, and the wounds were red and inflamed. "Honey, I think we've got fleas," John told his wife. Sarah sat up in bed, shaking her head. "I think so too," she sighed. "I saw a tiny insect when I was changing the sheets before bed." John glanced at the fresh bites on his forearm. The first thing that came to mind was the shelter. He ran a homeless shelter in their small town. He loved his work. But as the shelter grew and more people came and went, it seemed inevitable that he'd bring something unwanted home. He sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Let's deal with this tomorrow," he whispered to his wife as he lay back down. The next morning, over breakfast, they discussed their plan of action. Sarah scolded John for bringing home unwanted guests and complained about always being the one to keep the house clean. John managed to calm her down, but she wasted no time in coming up with a strategy. For the next week, they vacuumed every corner of their home, threw out sheets, pillows, and even old rugs. They did the same at the shelter, hiring a professional exterminator to inspect and treat both locations. But weeks passed, and nothing improved. John continued waking up with fresh bites every morning, his skin covered in new scars. Meanwhile, Sarah remained completely untouched, which made them question everything. "This doesn't make any sense," John exclaimed one evening, his frustration boiling over. "We've done everything, fumigation, deep cleaning, so why am I the only one suffering?" Sarah had no answer. She was just as exhausted from the constant cleaning and worrying. Then, one Saturday evening, she decided they needed a break. Between the house and shelter problems, they had barely had any time for themselves. Sarah made popcorn, and they curled up to watch their favorite movie. For the first time in weeks, they felt like themselves again, laughing at old jokes, enjoying the warmth of home. All their worries momentarily faded. But then, as John leaned in, Sarah suddenly froze. "Sweetheart?" John asked, puzzled. Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she leaned closer, pushing his hair aside to get a better look. Her hand flew to her mouth, and her face went pale. "Oh God. No," she gasped in horror, stumbling backward. "Get your phone. We need to see a doctor right away," she said, taking John's hand and leading him to the car. At the clinic, the doctor listened attentively to Sarah's account from the bites on John, their failed attempts to deal with the fleas, to what she had seen in his hair. The doctor nodded calmly, making notes as he gestured for John to sit in the examination chair. After putting on a pair of gloves, he parted John's hair and examined his scalp carefully. John's skin showed small bumps that could have looked like tiny cysts. But when the doctor used a magnifying glass, he discovered small holes in John's scalp, with tiny, wriggling creatures moving inside them. "I'm afraid to say this, but these aren't fleas," Dr. Carlos said. "Have you eaten raw meat recently? Or interacted with people who might have ingested spoiled food? I work at a homeless shelter, John replied. He wasn't sure if the problem had started there. But he knew that some of the people he helped lived in less than ideal hygiene conditions. That could explain how you got infected, the doctor said. John and Sarah exchanged a worried glance. What exactly did he catch? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Carlos sighed deeply. It could be the bites of helminths, parasitic worms like roundworms or tapeworms. People usually mistake their bites for flea irritation. But they aren't fleas. These worms bite. And they release toxins that are dangerous to humans, causing mostly neurological problems in their host. John stared at the doctor, his head spinning from what he had just heard. Neurological problems? Are you serious? He asked, hoping for a different answer. Dr. Carlos nodded seriously. Yes. And judging by John's condition after weeks of contact with them, he likely already has symptoms. Sarah gasped, covering her face with her hands. Oh my God. John. This explains so much. What do you mean? John asked, furrowing his brows. Sarah looked at him, tears welling up in her eyes, threatening to spill. You've been forgetting little things lately. Like where you put the car keys, whether you locked the car, or even the names of people at the shelter. I've seen you struggle to remember simple things. I thought you were just tired from your daily work. But now I know why, she said, embracing her husband. Dr. Carlos placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. It's good you noticed this in time. These worms are dangerous, but their bites are treatable if caught early. For now, I'll provide a solution for local use to wash his hair. This solution will kill the worms and their eggs. And then you'll come back tomorrow so we can check the progress. After that, we'll prescribe a combination of medications to help your body eliminate the toxins and restore lost cognitive functions. You'll also need to come in for weekly checkups to monitor his progress. John nodded, absorbing the doctor's words. Then asked, what about the house and the shelter? What if these diseases have spread? What if I'm not the only one who's been affected? That's a valid concern, Dr. Carlos replied. I'll recommend a pest control specialist who handles rare cases of infection like this. You'll need to thoroughly treat both places to make sure they're eradicated. As for the others, some checks may be necessary. On the way home, Sarah was unusually silent. She simply drove straight ahead. John glanced at her, his expression filled with worry. What are you thinking? He asked gently. Sarah's grip on the steering wheel tightened. I don't want to admit it, but I'm scared, she said, her voice barely audible. I'm afraid of what could have happened if I hadn't noticed in time. What if your memory loss got worse? What if you forgot me? She fell silent, tears streaming down her face. John reached over and soothingly placed his hand on hers. Hey, don't think like that. You noticed. You saved me. Sarah. It's because of you that we'll get through this together. She nodded, but the tension on her face didn't ease. I've been thinking. She began hesitantly. Maybe it's time to close the shelter. John turned his head in shock. No. Why would we close the shelter? Sarah took his hand. Listen. I know how much the shelter means to you. You've done so much for it," she said quickly, trying to speak evenly. "But look what it's done to you. You've gotten sick because of it more than once. I can't lose you." John. John was silent for a long time, staring out of the window. Finally, he spoke. "I understand why you feel that way, Sarah. But those people out there, they're just like us. They're trying to survive, trying to feel like human beings. If we close the shelter, where will they go? Who will help them?" Sarah sighed, wiping away her tears. The next few weeks were tough for the couple. It was a whirlwind of procedures, doctor visits, and pest control measures. The topical solution worked wonders. It killed the remaining worms on John's skin and in his hair. He then began taking medications to detoxify his body. And slowly but surely, his memory improved. Sarah worked tirelessly by his side. Specialists found several nests of tapeworms in the shelter's dormitories. Most likely, they were brought in by someone who unknowingly carried them. Treating the shelter was a painstaking process. But in the end, the pests were eradicated. Regular pest checks were organized. And Sarah educated the residents about hygiene and pest control. The changes she made improved the situation significantly. And soon the shelter was running better than ever. When John returned to the shelter, everyone was happy. That morning, there was a quiet bustle in the shelter as he walked through its doors. The residents greeted him warmly. Over the years, John had built strong bonds with many of them. And they had missed him during the few weeks he was gone. The shelter wasn't just a building. It was a second chance for so many people. And it reminded him why he fought so hard to keep it open. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Sarah, holding 2 cups of coffee. She had now become a part of the shelter, actively involved in its operations. "You know, I think I finally understand the real meaning of the shelter," Sarah said. John raised an eyebrow. Intrigued. She hesitated for a moment, then continued. "During the few weeks I've been here, I've seen how this place helps people. I hadn't realized it before. But when you weren't here, I saw how much the people value you. The way they look at you, like they belong here. Like they've found their purpose. I realized that this place doesn't just help people survive. It helps them heal. And that's why you've been fighting so hard to keep it open." After watching the story above, do you have any thoughts? Feel free to share your opinions in the comments section. If you enjoyed our video, please like, subscribe, and share our channel. That's all about today's stories. See you next time.